having enough time. Um, okay, so this is an issue that I think we've all been facing in terms of how to address AI issues with students. And it's something that if we're not doing it, we probably should be doing a bit more of this. Um, and if you'd like a copy of these slides, and there are a few links to resources, you can either aim your camera at the QR code, or you can grab the URL at the bottom. And let me see if I can, oh, I guess, okay, one more time. I'm going to hop out for just a second, grab that URL and put it in the chat. I'm going to try to grab that URL and put it in the chat. Okay, so, and then, you can do anything you want with these slides, including delete them if you find it not useful. But, there are a number of disconnects that we see. One is that there's a tremendous amount of evidence that most students are using AI fairly regularly. In fact, there's a link to just some survey data here, and we can hop on that, that over 80% of students at a selective U.S. college was using AI. 86% in a global survey, 86, these are all for college students, 86% of students use AI in their studies, with very large proportions using it weekly or daily. 92% of students in another survey reported that they were using AI in their studies, and so forth. And there's been a pretty dramatic increase in the usage in just the last year. And we've been seeing that pretty much every year, that the level of use by students has been growing. Um, so yeah, in fact, in the HEPI study, or HEPI, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, the use rose from 66% of students reporting regular use to 92% between 2024 and 2025. And when you ask students, though, if they're using AI, they're often fairly reluctant to say that. We had a meeting, we have a student committee on learning and teaching here. And when we first brought the issue of AI use up, most of them said, oh, it's really bad, it damages your learning and so forth. Until a couple of the faculty there said, well, it could be useful in these ways. And all of a sudden, the whole tenor of the discussion changed, and they pretty much all talked about how they've used it in certain circumstances. They had some concerns about use of it in terms of ethics and cheating and so forth, but they also, were much more willing to talk about it. So, we have this environment where students, during the pandemic, students were warned about, all the cheating tools out there with Chegg and other things. And, they were told that they're going to flunk the course if they're caught cheating and so forth. And the same sort of thing has occurred with AI. There's a lot of faculty who just tell students that AI use is prohibited, and that's as far as it gets. There's no discussion of why or under what circumstances it may be appropriate and why perhaps it may not be appropriate in other circumstances. Yet, on the other hand, surveys of employers suggest that they expect that students should be leaving college with at least some ability to work with AI tools. And yet, most faculty don't spend a lot of time assisting students in how to use AI appropriately. So that's one of the things we should probably all address in our course. On our campus, we do have a syllabus statement requirement or a recommendation. I'm not sure if Liz, is it a formal requirement or is it just a strong recommendation at this point?
At this point, I don't think we've changed the handbook to make this an essential element of the syllabus. I think it should be having the statement, right? But at this point, it's not. I mean, the faculty handbook's a giant dumpster fire, outdated mess. So adding things to it becomes problematic because it just right.
Yes,
That's a whole
but
other thing. But yeah, I mean, but that doesn't say departments, and then take this back to your department or your college unit and say, you know, everyone at the department can have an agreement. I think we did, John, that everyone needs an AI statement, right? As a department, we're not telling you what that needs to be, right? But everyone needs to have one.
yes, and that's something we all should have been doing from the beginning. And many of us have, but it's something that if you're not doing, you should. And it should go further than just saying AI use is prohibited. Um, And what I strongly suggest is that even in the syllabus statement, you explain why you're doing that. Whatever restrictions you're placing on it, or in whatever way students are being asked to encourage to use AI, explain the reasons for it. It doesn't have to be long, but just motivate that. Don't just say it's banned or don't just say it's allowed. Explain the conditions under which it's allowed and when it's not allowed. And some of the issues there is, you may want to refer to the importance of developing some basic skills that they need to be able to do more than just type prompts because it doesn't require a college degree or a major in a specific fields to be able to use AI tools. So, talk about the importance of developing some automaticity, some basic skills in the discipline so that you're able to evaluate output of AI. And also, you may want to mention some of the ethical issues associated with the use in terms of intellectual property and such things. Um, One thing that I always have been, well, I've been recommending since the beginning of AI's appearance, when it caught us by surprise, pretty much about 3 years, a little over 3 years ago, is to co-create an AI syllabus statement with your students. In larger classes, that may be a little bit tougher, but at least get some students' reactions to it. And, one strategy that you could use if you're in a reasonably sized class of, 20 to 50 students or 20 to 40 students is to break students up into groups, have them discuss when AI might be appropriate, when it's not, and have them share that with the group and with the whole class, discuss it, and then formulate it based on feedback from students. In smaller classes, that's a lot easier, but it's something worth considering. I've done that in some of my smaller classes in terms of, well, in classes in econometrics and in the capstone. I've had some class discussions of this. Um, and, one of the things that's generally encouraged to have a good discussion about AI is be transparent about when you use it and why you use it and how it may be useful and in what ways you find it appropriate. Or if there's ways in which you don't find it appropriate, mention that and talk about some of the reasons why you're choosing not to use it in particular ways. And a good thing to do is to reflect on how AI use is being used in your field. And we don't know how it's going to be used in a year or two, but at least we can talk about some of the ways in which it's being used now, some of the efficiency it brings, and some of the concerns that it may bring. And again, that could be a good basis for discussion. But you probably know more about that than many of your students do. And if not, it's probably good to investigate that and to find out more about that. Um, but AI tools are basically prediction and or generative AI programs are essentially prediction engines where they're predicting the next word based on the context with given probabilities and so forth. And no matter how they're structured, they're going to be generating some output that are hallucinations. And you need to be able to evaluate that. And, perhaps talk to students about the importance of developing those critical thinking skills. And you could give them some examples where things went wrong when students didn't have that sort of a basis, and so on. Um, and also, again, remind students that they need to be able to add something beyond just what the AI tools can do if they hope to have a job or if they hope to get some sort of return on their investment in education. And one of the things to talk about are what are some of the uniquely human contributions that students should be developing so that they're able to go beyond just generating prompts and copy and pasting responses from AI tools. And that's going to vary a lot across disciplines. And one of the things I think that's really worth talking to students about is the removal of those desirable difficulties that Bjork and Bjork have talked about. That in general, we learn more when we struggle a bit with learning, that we're more likely to recall information that we had to, or information and models and schemas and so forth when we struggled to assemble those in our own mind, basically. And if we just use AI to generate output, we skip over that. There's a lot of concern about cognitive offloading, and it's worth addressing those things that, working through this, working through challenges is a really important part of learning. And it's something they're going to have to be doing in the future. And being in college is a great time to do that when the costs of making mistakes and so forth are relatively low. So it's worth addressing all these things and perhaps using that to help frame the discussion. And in terms of ethical issues, there's a number of things that always should be brought up. One is copyright issues, that all of the generative AI platforms were pretty much ignoring copyright law when they sucked up their training databases and so forth. And that's worth mentioning to students. And, that these are legal issues and legal principles that have pretty much been abandoned in this process. And of course, there's hundreds of lawsuits going on right now trying to address some of those issues. Issues of intellectual property in terms of, what components of your work do you want to share with the training database, and also, talk about what tools are available and whether the tools available on your campus are being used to train the AI platforms and so forth. Now, if you're using an institutional license, here at Oswego, we have a license for Gemini. In that information, anything that's put in there is not being used to train the model. But if students are using the personal accounts of Gemini or any of the other platforms, most of that information will be used as part of the training database. So let's remind them that information they store there, they should be careful about. Now, one of the things that there's a lot of discussions about, without a lot of evidence, actually, is the environmental impact. I know there's been so many discussions of this, but what in terms of the impact in terms of energy demand, there have been a few studies of this. Google released a study last September or October where they noted that a typical prompt, an average prompt or a medium prompt given to Gemini used as much energy as a typical Google query did about 8 or 9 years ago. And that a typical prompt going into an AI platform now uses as much energy as about 6 seconds of streaming video. So, we are using a tremendous amount of energy and water use and so forth in cooling these server farms. But AI use is a fairly tiny, at this point at least, is still a fairly small drop in the bucket. Streaming video and also cryptocurrencies, which are just basically server farms cranking out nothing other than these cryptocurrency units, are using far more energy than AI. And a related point is, if AI is working well, it can actually save energy and allow us to be more efficient in production techniques and so forth. So those costs are real, but they're often overemphasized in a lot of the discussions. The issue of bias, again, is one everyone's heard about and so forth. And we've seen lots of examples of that, that prompts or the AI platforms have been trained on human generated materials, and any of the bias that humans have in generating those materials shows up in the output of these platforms. And I know many of the companies have tried to address this. In some cases, they've over addressed it and then had to back off a little bit when they were generating things that were, well, there was a case for a while where Google was generating images that were not realistic for the time period that they were supposed to be used in, because they were trying to be more balanced. We didn't see a lot of females or Black individuals in the legislatures back in the 1700s and 1800s and so forth. And so there was a little bit of an overcompensation, But again, bias is out there. And if you ask for images of doctors, they often are more likely to turn out to be male. If you ask for images of professors, they're more likely to be males with many platforms. Although again, they are trying generally to rebalance that a bit. Data privacy, again, is something you should talk about in terms of what information it's safe to upload into a platform and what perhaps you shouldn't. The PII, as it's called, the personally identifiable information, and we have a session on that, I think, tomorrow here, where CTS will be talking about what types of information it's safe to disclose to an AI platform and which platforms it's safe to disclose them and where you should not do that. In general, we should not be uploading student work to these platforms, especially ones that use it for a training database, and certainly not any information about names, phone numbers, social security numbers, credit card numbers, or any of those things. And that should be obvious, but it may not always be obvious to students who are just see the benefits of using these tools. Okay, now I've provided, and this is one of the reasons why I shared the slides, there's a lot of examples. Pretty much all colleges out there have some AI syllabus statements in terms of what types of things you may want to include. And again, they should all list what's allowed, what's not allowed, and so forth. And you can scroll through these, or you can ask any of the platforms to generate a syllabus statement that meets the criteria that you find appropriate. And if it doesn't quite work the way you want it to, interact with it. The best way to use these tools is to just keep having it refine the prompts and have a conversation until you get to something that you're happy with. Are there any things, any questions about what should be in a syllabus statement or any recommendations from anyone of what they put in their syllabus statements?
I have I've gone the middle road with the boundary use of AI. And so that's been in my syllabus statement now for at least 2 years. And I was very explicit, based on the learning activities that are graded, in this course and things like that. I had, I put like a red X, like these are things you can't be using it for, and sort of this green check, and like these are okay uses, and things like that. And yeah. So I mean, I actually have that. I don't really know how much it works. I mean, are they listening? Are they not? But we actually have the conversation and why. I talk about things that I've used it for. In the freshman first year signature course that I had this fall, we actually, explicitly we took a class period, and I had a handout that I kind of edited from the original one. Stephanie Pritchard has made handouts about prompting. And so we started with that, and we did a whole in-class workshop about how they could brainstorm ideas for their semester-long project, through that. And we went through that, and talked about ideas and how you evaluate it and why you weren't happy with the ideas you're getting. And so how would you change the prompt to sort of address that, and things like that. So I mean, I would say two things can be right as once. AI is here. There's nothing we can do about it. These outright bans are probably not effective at all, and particularly less effective as it gets better. At the same time, I think AI seems to be more of a threat to higher education and its purpose than other things. I mean, John and I were here when the fact that Google existed mean that we weren't going to teach introductory courses anymore. Remember that? That was like what, 2005? Good times, right? Or MOOCs were going to put out of business. You probably remember that one. So, we've actually, many of us here have lived through these technological innovations that were going to, kill higher education or education in general, and they didn't. I think there's things about AI that are just fundamentally different about that. At the same time, there's nothing I can really do about it. Right? No one, not a mover shaker in the tech world or anywhere else for that matter. So I mean, there's nothing I can do about it. So I think these things can be the same at once, and I think that's why faculty grapple with it. Sometimes this AI issues and the way it's taken hold can drive me to despair. At the same time, I think I have a responsibility to sort of acknowledge it and integrate it, and try and motivate students to use it in a way that it's a complement to their learning and not a substitute for it. So.
Yes, none of us asked for this, and it's being done in a way that's completely unregulated, at least by educators, and we have little control over the process, and that's important to acknowledge. And let students know that too, that this may not be how you would like to see AI being introduced or allowed. However, it's a reality we have to deal with, and that's important. And it's a reality we have to deal with in pretty much all aspects of our lives, certainly in terms of career use, in terms of people's jobs and so forth. And we have no idea how job markets are going to be ultimately affected by all this. And there's a lot of concerns there. But yeah, talk about all those things. And you also might want to note that, AI use will vary at different stages of the semester, that things that you may not want it being used in some early stages of the course, but as students develop some proficiency in basic skills, then perhaps using AI assistance might be appropriate. Michael notes that he gives students permission to ask AI for sample questions to practice, but not to use the practice exam questions that he wrote as AI prompts. And so you've got to think about what boundaries are appropriate for your class and just explain why. Students generally are more likely to respond to this than just to a blanket ban, because there's a lot of evidence that, as Liz said, one thing that pretty much never works is just saying don't use AI. It just tends to be seen as not a very realistic statement by students, and so
Also would fall. I think it's really important that you actually, what you can require is not just that you cite it, but you can add, I've added in terms of my rubric, there's a mandatory reflective piece about AI use and all of that. And if, and that's, and the things where I've actually had to go to academic dishonesty for the inappropriate AI use, right? Which is, it's clearly stated in my course, so there's no mistaking it, is, they're not, and the reflection isn't honest, or they just don't cite it at
and
all. And so I can't,
and
prove, say, oh, you totally wrote this by AI. But you can find pieces and say, clearly you used
and
the assistance of an LLM
we
and you did
And
not.
we will get to
Yeah.
that. Those will be coming up later too. But yeah,
Okay.
but you know, another point though related to this is that just a syllabus statement is not enough. That if you're, I'm not sure, I actually somehow jumped out of there. 1 second. Here we go. Okay. What I would strongly recommend is that in each assignment you put in the parameters, which could include, as Liz said, some type of reflection component, or it could even be sharing the AI prompts that you use and the responses, as well as the work that you've got. So if AI is being used, you might want to actually have students reflect on how it worked and why it was used and keep a log of it, or maybe even share a link to their work or copy and paste the whole discussion, the whole interactions in there. But in general, a statement at the beginning of the term on the first day of class or in the syllabus is not something that students are necessarily going to remember a week or two later, or 3 weeks later, or 3 months later. So, include that in each of the major assignments that you're using, or at least remind them of it periodically. One thing I've strongly recommended in general, besides for this purpose, is using Marion Winklemas's tilt approach. And in that case, each assignment has three components. When you share an assignment with students, you have a statement of the purpose of the assignment. And one thing that can be really helpful is if you tie it into career readiness skills, such as the NACE competencies. And that's also something you may want to include in your syllabus. But one of the things that surveys have shown is that students have increasingly felt that what they're learning in college and high school, for that matter, is less connected to their future life and careers than it was in the past. That students see a disconnect between what they're learning and the skills and their future lives. And if we can show that what they're learning in classes is going to be helpful at some point in the future, that makes it so much more likely that they're going to have a little more intrinsic motivation to learn that. Um, So you include a purpose. It could be just a few sentences describing it, the task that has to be completed so that you're transparent about what you expect, well, what students should be doing, and also the criteria for evaluation, which could be sharing a rubric. It could involve sharing some sample work and so forth. And what Marianne Winklemas and other people who've used this approach have done is shown that this tends to increase learning for all students, tends to increase motivation, it tends to increase course completion rates, but the impact is largest for students who are most likely left behind. So it's really helpful using the tilt approach, and that can be a lot of work with each assignment unless perhaps you use AI to assist with that. And a number of people have generated, say, GPTs or other things, chatbots, where you can submit an assignment, your course learning objectives, and it will automatically convert that assignment into a tilted assignment. And that's worth using. Now, one other thing that some people have been suggesting recently, including some of the authors of some of the current books on teaching with AI, is you may want to give students a choice. This was something that came up in a podcast we did a few weeks ago with Anna Mills. And one of the things, I think it was with her, one of the things she suggested was that some students really don't want to use AI. Some students are really excited about using AI. And if you have some specific learning objectives you want to include, you might include two or three versions of the assignment, one in which AI is not being used at all, one at the other extreme where it involves heavy use of AI, but perhaps more reflection and more elaboration and more critical analysis, or perhaps something in between, where there's moderate use. And again, you don't have to do all the work of thinking those up yourself. You could give a description of the assignment and ask your AI tools to generate alternative versions with different level of AI use built into it and different criteria and rubrics for each, and let students choose which pathway they wish to choose. It's an option. And this would have been a lot of work before we had AI tools to assist us, but this can allow us to do a little bit more in generating different versions and providing more individualized instruction, perhaps. It's worth at least contemplating when we're not working on a Title II and all the other things we have to make sure we meet compliance with. Um, so, but what do you do when, or why will this break down? And it always breaks down. I think we've all seen lots of students using AI where we're hoping they're not. What surveys have shown is there's a few reasons that are really common for this. A lot of students are faced with time pressure challenges. Many students are working part-time. The number of students who are working outside of class and hours worked have actually increased after several decades of decreasing. So the last couple of decades, we've seen this rising. We see a lot of concern over grades and, grade pressure, even going back to the No Child Left Behind. Scores and tests and other things have been greatly emphasized in our whole educational system. And that leads to more anxiety over students, where their success is measured by their grade. And that's especially true when there's high stakes assignments where they only get one attempt at them. Other issues that show up is students may feel they're not capable of doing the work, that they have a lack of faith in their own ability to be successful without that, which could be due to imposter syndrome, stereotype threat, or just having a fixed mindset, much of which can have been conditioned by their past experience. But one of the things we should think about a little bit is in terms of all these issues, are all students equally affected by these issues? Who is most likely to be faced with more time pressure or more concern about their ability to do the work and so on? Anyone want to make some suggestions here?
Our more vulnerable students will be, um, and there are equity issues, but many of our students come to us more vulnerable also have a skill deficit relative to the students that are maybe less so. And so it
Right.
becomes crucially important that they don't skip that development step and goes. I understand they're more tempted to it, but in some ways, I think AI is more harmful to this. Like you or me using AI to run a first time draft of a rubric that we then edit to what we really want. right? As we kind of been through that stage, we've actually drafted rubrics long before LLMs, right? So we know what to do, we've done them, we've used them. So the fact that I use it as a shortcut means I'm using it as a complement, as a productivity aid. But some of our
Right.
most vulnerable students, the skill development is crucial in sort of trying to catch up and have this value added to employers. So now it's really become a substitute for skill development. And I don't have a solution for it, but you're right. I think, people who come there thinking, imposter syndrome, thinking they don't really belong in college, that they don't have the skill set, um, that they don't, they're overwhelmed with the time commitment to develop it, right? And to catch up are going to be more prone to use AI, but they're actually the ones most hurt by it as well.
Yeah. And that's a cycle it would be helpful if we could try to break in some way
Well,
because,
okay. Well, good
you
luck with
know, yeah,
that.
we have a very inequitable educational system where the quality of the education you receive is determined by the wealth of the communities in which you live, by the educational level of parents in the communities, and all sorts of other things that are way beyond our control and beyond the control of the students. And we'd like our assessments to be based on how much skills students have at the end of the course, not necessarily where they started from. And students, as Liz noted, start at very, very different starting points when they enter. And those are the students who are more likely to be threatened by all these things. Students who've come from a school system where they had lots of college preparation are likely to be more successful and not worry as much about these things, maybe. Um, you know, but there are ways we can try to address some of those. Um, any suggestions on favorite ways of addressing some of these issues to prevent students from being as concerned about these issues?
I think for me, a big is just like explaining the use of it goes back to the tilt thing, like explaining the purpose of the assignment. Um, and what you mentioned early on about like needing to have some set of skills beyond AI, otherwise you're not going to have a job in the future, right? So that kind of self-analysis of like, if I can do this assignment very easily with AI, that's not a good sign. I should probably change my major, right? Um, and so um, yeah, I guess kind of stressing the value of the assignment and that it's not really just a way to fill the time. It's like there's a reason why I'm giving this to you.
Mhm. And time
I
pressure.
agree with that idea that if someone realizes they can do something easily with AI, that means they're going to change their major. I think that when they see that they can do something easily with AI, they're going to keep doing it to the point that I've had students, on my evaluations just literally say, I didn't learn a thing from the professor. I just used Chat GPT for the whole semester. And this was a class that had a high pass rate. So this fairly good chance the student passed the course using Chat GPT the whole way through. So no, I disagree that use of a easy use of AI is, going to deter students. I think it's going to entice students to just use it more and more.
I think what I meant by that is just that as a warning to the students, right? Like if they find they're able to pass this class and get as much out of it by using AI to do their assignments, that's a bad sign for their potential future careers.
Do they
And
see that
making it
as a bad sign for their potential careers? I don't think they see that as a bad sign.
Mm,
But perhaps that could be addressed in these
right.
conversations with students that if they're not learning these skills and they're just using AI, they're not developing the skills that they're going to need to be able to apply these concepts or to use AI tools effectively.
It also highlights, we talked about equity issues in education, but it also highlights this constraint optimization problem that instructors and institutions solve, right? So large classes is one example of this. So, John had what? You had over 200 and Eco 101.
250, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, at 250 students, the kind of maybe authentic assessments that would be potentially harder to replicate with AI, right? Or potentially more intrinsically motivating to students and stuff, that becomes a lot harder. Like a lot of, and a lot of, 3 years ago, a lot of these anti-AI designed assignments, right, don't work anymore. Like, and then, right. So we've gotten past that. But I think the other issue is that it doesn't scale. So, part of it is, if students are kind of getting through class in AI and can earn an A that way, I've felt, and sometimes it leads me to despair because it speaks to the activities that I design and use, right? I think it does. I think it's at least in part a reflection on me. On the other hand, it's a reflection on decisions I made about, frequent low stakes assignments, right? Being demonstrably important. At the same time, I can't actually do that if I actually make the assignments too, I don't know, intricate or require that. Faculty on faculty forums across the US have switched to oral exams, right? Oral exams for 250 sounds like a good time, right, John? So I mean, I think those things kind of come to a head. So education has developed systems of, summative assessment, instructors in the classroom that kind of reflect that trade-off, right? And also spending, for junior faculty, spending too much time building and implementing authentic assessments that might minimize this problem are then not spending enough time on other things like research. So that's
And providing low stakes tests with multiple attempts and then so forth is really helpful in terms of learning, but it also increases the time pressure on those students who already have to spend the most time working outside of class and who come in with a weaker background. And we've got a lot of cycles there that would be helpful we could break. With high stake assignments, that's kind of easy to replace them with low stake assignments, but that also increases student workload. And if we're going to be grading all those things, which in some cases, some disciplines, it's hard to completely avoid. I don't think many people here are using Gradescope or other AI tools for grading. Um, it imposes more work on the instructor and students. So we'll have to see how this goes. There are some approaches that do integrate instructor feedback and AI feedback, and we'll talk about those in some other workshops. But these are things to think about. And if we could relax some of these, giving students more opportunities to be successful, even if they struggle initially in the class, if we could take some of the grade anxiety away and have the focus shift from grades to learning, we'll talk about some strategies for that, and just getting rid of high stakes assignments or high stakes assessment to the extent possible, while maintaining questions of integrity and so on. There are some techniques we can use to help students build a growth mindset, but that requires continuous reinforcement. Okay, so
John,
yes,
John, can you hear me, John? This is Mike Murphy
yes,
from English. I'm in the car, and I'm sorry, I didn't know. There's no way for me to raise my hand on my car screen.
that's okay.
Just to unmute. I was just going to jump in and say a couple of things from the perspective of English 102. Liz, you were talking about the ways that students who have lower skills come in with lower skills are handicapped and are done a disservice by AI if they tend to use AI. One of the things that my colleagues and I have been finding is that students who's come in with limited skills also have a hard time using AI well, particularly in connection with writing. Both in terms of sort of like merging voice will be wildly different in ways that they can't really control if they use any language at all from AI. But also in terms of reading, like the one thing that I find is that when students play around with AI, if their rhetorical skills aren't strong, they tend not to be good readers. And so the labor of going back to read through and think about whatever kind of language they get back from AI is sort of overwhelming. In terms of working with, like I think John, you were talking about ways to sort of respond. I find that individual discussions that point those things out, at conference each time a student writes in English 102. So when I can point out those sorts of difficulties, they tend to agree, and they tend to be they tend to be persuaded that there are certain kinds of skills that they need to develop before they can use AI in a really sort of effective way. I'll also say that speaks directly to the problem, Liz, that you were talking about in terms of labor. I will only suggest that I think that the work of higher education gets more and more labor intensive all the time. I don't know. That seems like it's the nature of this moment. But I do, as for finding simple ways to do this, I don't know.
Yes, to all those things. It is challenging. Um, so when you find someone that you suspect of using AI inappropriately in violation of the course guidelines, it's really easy to feel like this is an insult to you, that they've done something that bothers you, that it's offensive. Talk to the students about it. They generally see it differently, that their perspectives of what's ethical based on lots of surveys out there is very different than our perspectives on what is ethical. We've been in this business for a while. We tended to focus more on these things, and plagiarism was a really big issue when we were coming up through the educational system. It's not always seen that way by our students. So talk to them about it. Talk about whether they used AI and how, um, talk about the challenges, those things about how they're not gaining from the course when they're doing this, and also how the quality of the writing perhaps could be better if they put more of a human element in it. And one question, you should think about is whether, and this was something that came up, we had a reading group this past semester on the opposite of cheating. One of the things that people have suggested is that having giving students another chance to do things on their own is good, but we have to be careful that if we're going to do that, we should probably be transparent about with the entire class, and maybe put in some sort of a cost or penalty associated with that, because one of the concerns is that if students submit something with AI and then you let them redo it, they're effectively getting a bit of an extension, which if you're going to do that for the students who violated the norms, you should probably make available to everyone, or at least impose some sort of a cost on that, or just so that we're not incentivizing students to submit AI work and so forth. And if it's a minor issue, talking with them and perhaps having them redo it might be a good solution. If this is happening repeatedly, though, it's probably a little bit more troubling. And one of the questions, though, is we've seen a few students who, when confronted with what appears to be obvious AI use, just deny it. Um, Most students, when you talk to them about it and just question them about what they wrote and why they wrote it and why they chose those arguments, just having that discussion will usually result, for me, probably 95% of the time, in the students admitting to it. But not always. And what do you do in those cases when students are just adamant that they have not used AI? With other forms of cheating in the past, it was pretty easy to establish. With Chegg, for a long time, we were able to get the IP addresses of the questions they visited and show at what times they did it, what computer they were used on, and that was the same computer that they used to submit their assessments and so forth in Brightspace or Blackboard or whatever. But it's a whole lot harder with AI. Some cases are obvious when they just copy and paste and they include like the ending questions that AI puts in, like I can also generate this. Or I had a student way back in the early days, just a month or so, a couple of months after ChatGPT was released, who I asked him, that was back in the days when we had a limit on the training database, where I asked him to look at some recent BLS data and to describe the changes in unemployment and inflation rates that occurred and what factors might have been, the cause of that. And the student submitted a response that said, as an AI tool, I do not have access to this data, but you can find it on the BLS website at this address. And that particular student just copied and pasted that right in, and it made it kind of obvious that that was not his own work. But it's not as obvious today in general, unless they copy and paste, specific parts of the prompts that, aren't, well, that are asking them for further information. And that I've seen lots of cases where students have done that. But AI tools are getting much better, and it's harder to distinguish AI generated work from student generated work. As Liz said, the things that worked initially in terms of the training database and the timing of that don't work anymore because pretty much all AI tools now have search capabilities, can look up current information and embed that. Well, one approach I want you to at least think about is this is something that Anna Mills has been doing. And she had a really good discussion on our podcast, and she does this on many podcasts and so forth. But she started to use an AI detector again. Initially, she was opposed to them, but she's built it into her course again. But she notes when she meets with students when their work is flagged as a high probability of it being AI generated, she meets with them, she discusses it, and she says, I know that these AI detectors make mistakes. And so, this doesn't prove that you used AI, but your work does not appear to be significant. I'm paraphrasing, it doesn't appear to be significantly different than what an AI bot would generate, and so forth. Um, and discussing it with students who she said generally will admit to it, but in some cases they talk about their process and how they used AI, and it turned out that they had used AI only in polishing their final draft, but the work was all theirs, and they were able to show her the evolution of that in the Google Doc history or in other things, or in terms of the outlines they had created at various stages. Um, but when there's a high probability and it looks like they probably did it, she just has them redo the work without any penalty, and she allows that option for all students anyway, which again is a lot of work. Another thing, by the way, she does is she uses the pair approach, PAIRR, which involves a combination of peer review and this is on student writing process. She uses a combination of peer review by other students and then AI review. That's the AI part of that review, and before the instructor sees the final part, the final submission. And yeah, Liz notes that if students are using AI uncited and your policies require citation, that would be a violation. So just be explicit about that. If AI is allowed, have students cite the work that is used. So as long as you can demonstrate that they have done that, and it's hard to prove AI use. And there have been instructors here who accused every single student of using AI, and maybe they did, but there wasn't really a lot of evidence to support that case. And
I would also add, AI detectors, and this is a problem for funsies. Just a few months ago during the fall semester, I ran a paper I wrote in the 1990s through the AI detector, and it came up as, very high probability of AI generation. So I guess this means I write like a robot, which I'm not really happy about myself, or maybe I did in the 1990s. Hopefully I got better. But, I actually ran it through old papers and I got false positives. So, there are some major problems with AI detectors, and even though they're not enough alone confronting about them, I don't know. I think that's a little problematic too. I mean, I think what you do is you see phrases that they didn't written. I've confronted students whose in-class work is just no resemblance to the AI work. And I ask them why. I ask them what they're doing, to produce this work outside of class. That's such an improvement. And I don't even start with you definitely used AI because of this. I just say there's this clear difference. So what strategies would you deploy so that your in-class work could actually match up to this or things like that? I usually only confront in sort of the worst cases, or like as John said, the obvious ones where like I'm an LLM and can't do this, or just a completely made up citation, saying you used a source that doesn't exist, which clearly means you didn't use it. And because of that, I'm only confronting these cases. They've all sort of admitted it to me. They haven't pushed back about it. Right?
and most students will confess once you chat with them about it. So it is important, and it is an issue we have to address, and it's a challenge. And it was so much easier when we could find the exact things they copied and pasted. It was much easier to demonstrate the use of. But again, if they generate work that sounds like it was generated by a machine, that may suggest they do need to improve their writing skills in some way. Although I do remember getting feedback on a paper when I was in college from an English professor who suggested that my writing was a little bit stilted. And if I still had that paper and I ran it through in a detector, it might show that it appeared to have been machine generated. And there is a bias in these things where there's a dramatically higher probability that students will be flagged as having AI generated material if the students are not native English speakers. That if English is a second language, they're more likely to use standard sorts of phrases and phrasing and structures that they learned in their writing classes. And that often shows up as a type of thing that predictive models would flag as being likely AI generated. Um, so, um, it's a challenge, and it's not going to get any easier because AI tools keep getting better and better. Just a few other things to think about. One way in which many people have claimed that they've been able to deter the use of AI inappropriately is by moving to alternative assessment techniques, things like ungrading or ungrading or contract grading or other things like that might be helpful. And another thing that many people have been moving to is instead of evaluating the products of learning, they focus on the process of learning by having students reflect on the process, share their process, share what they learned as they went through this. And the students are more likely to not use AI tools to generate those reflections, although AI tools are perfectly capable of generating those reflections. But at least the probability is lower. We do want to assess how much students have learned by the end, but we can detect that a bit from how they're evaluating their learning process and how they're evaluating how much they've learned through the process. It's something worth considering at least. So including metacognitive reflection, we know from a lot of research that just having students reflect on the learning and how their learning has gone and what they learn, what new skills or new concepts they've acquired and et cetera, can be helpful in increasing the amount that students learn. Um, Another way of doing this is to, instead of trying to block AI, to build AI into the process. That's something that Anna Mills and many other people have been working with, that pair model, where they have students write a draft, have them submit it to AI, have them submit it to a few peers, and have them reflect on the suggestions that came from peers, that came from AI, and write a reflection about how they've changed things in response to that, how they found the quality of the feedback from the peers relative to the quality of the feedback from AI. And then it goes to the instructor for final evaluation, along with the evaluations that were generated by AI and the peers. So it is a bit of work, but it is a nice way of doing that. And Liz, you said you incorporated AI into your online discussions in the fall.
Sure. And I'm still not sure how it went. And it was entirely, I'll just start with entirely selfish, cynical motivations. I'm like, I don't want to read AI discussion responses and have to argue with students about them the entire semester. I'm not doing that. So every discussion prompt, I had weekly discussions in an online asynchronous course. And every discussion prompt, it was a topic that we were covering. And they had to craft, and again, part of the scoring. And I think the next time I use it, I'm going to have a really strict rubric about prompt quality and really because you're right, prompt quality really varied. And they had to do, so the first one was they actually had to write a prompt about advice about career development based on specific career goals or interests they had right now, right? This was an upper level course, so they've had some time to think about it. They had to, copy the prompt, the AI, the AI they used, the prompt, and their output. And I had the output limited to so many words, right, in their prompt, so it wouldn't be super long. And then they had to analyze it. So basically, every week, instead of fighting about AI, they're basically required to use an AI to prompt and to analyze the output, and then replies. People were analyzing the other output of each one's. So, you know, I'm not sure if students liked it better in the feedback. It's an online course. I got about 30% response rates on evaluations, and there was one student who I knew was an older student who was a little disappointed, who said, I would have rather had a discussion where I could, really have more conversations directly with students in the classroom instead of just using this AI and all of that. So, I think that was partly due to what maybe it being an older student coming back and the student probably being more optimistic about how much authentic voice and discussion he would have gotten. So, I'm not sure how it went. I do know I just sort of kind of embraced it because I couldn't handle every week trying to deal with a bunch of AI bots talking to each other, right? And so by improving it, um, maybe they got some more prompting skills, maybe they could analyze the output and what it did and didn't have. So anyway.
Yeah. The AI prompts and discussion is why I stopped teaching online classes about a year ago, because that's pretty much all I was getting, and it was just getting really frustrating. So it, yes, you got really high quality grammar and statements in the discussion forum, but there wasn't really a lot of personal work being put into it. In at least that last class that I taught online. I haven't seen as much of that with in-person use, but it's an issue. Um, but in general, to the extent to which we can integrate AI in ways like Liz was talking about, where students do something and then evaluate it, they're learning how to use AI. They're learning how to critically evaluate the output of the AI. And there's a lot of people working on these types of assignments. So um, and there's a lot of examples out there of ways in which people are beginning to do this. We will be changing how we assess student learning. It's going to be a slow process, and it's going to be constantly challenging as AI tools evolve. One of the biggest challenges appearing right now on the horizon is the existence of AI agents that can log into an online class or any course, check to see what assignments are due, complete all that work, submit it, and then log out, and then give you a report of the work that was done. And that can all be done in minutes. So it's an interesting situation. So there's a lot of suggestions and a lot of groups, including the MLA, who've been demanding that the LMS providers take steps to prevent access by large language models and AI agents. But so far, that's not happening. That's going to be an interesting situation. Okay, so that's all I had prepared, and we're just about out of time. But any other suggestions or thoughts from anybody? It's an exciting time where we can completely change how we're teaching, but the changes are going to have to keep evolving. Actually, in a podcast we did this morning, Todd Kryzik said, there were a lot of techniques that people used for decades that worked really well, but that's not happening anymore. That we're all changing how we teach, and students are changing how they're learning, and that process is not going to stop in the near future. And it is exciting. It's interesting. It opens up so many possibilities where we can do things, for our students and create more personalized learning. But we also want to make sure that the learning actually occurs, as students learn how to use AI tools to expand their capabilities rather than as an alternative to developing their skills. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, well, we've got lots of other sessions coming up in terms of how we can use AI productively, and I'll see many of you at some of those.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.